What is going on, everyone? First off, pretty pumped. I actually hit the intro right and everything like that. So that's definitely a good day for us. I got my man, Evan Willsmore, coming here. Some may know him as Evan Williams. Evan Williams sounds like a basketball player, you know?
Yeah, man. Don't. That's an inside joke. We'll keep that one inside, but always funny to hear that, man.
Catch me inside. How about that? Well, man, first off, congrats to you as players are reporting now for your team and whatnot, the
Yep.
Vegas Nighthawks. So that's kind of taken shape a little bit. On the back end, we're about 2.5 weeks in the training camp. The media days are starting to kick off and whatnot. In my opinion, there's been some not over exaggeration, but over reactions to some injuries that have happened. There's been kind of these I don't even really know how to say it, these media days that are going on with the players that are kind of, less than stellar in my opinion. What do you think about this lack of uniform release that's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the result of, this kind of rushed approach that they took. It took them a long time to announce the merger, unveil everything, that the initial report came out in, I think it was September from Axios or whatever outlet it was that reported it first. And then they didn't announce it officially until New Year's, right? And that's only, a little over 2 months ago. So in the past 2 months, they've kind of had to scramble and everything, I don't want to say it feels rushed because, they're carrying over a lot of stuff from last year from both sides. But I think you're seeing, some of the, I don't know if the right word is falling out, but like you're starting to see some of those difficulties when, you only have so many weeks to prepare, right? And I mean, the training camp, they've been in that for a couple weeks now, but, there's a lot of people saying, well, you wouldn't really know. I mean, other than the transactions that are being posted and, some of the media access that certain people are getting, it's been pretty quiet so far. So I think, again, a lot of that just comes from the fact that this is another new league. It's another new thing. You're joining forces from two parties that, again, were similar with the XFL and the USFL, but they weren't exactly the same, right? I'm not sure if Daryl Johnston and Russ Brandon are necessarily the same person, even though they've both worked in football ops or whatever you want to call it for some of these leagues. But yeah, man, I mean, you hope that those issues get ironed out, and hopefully by the time the season kicks off in about 3 weeks, that things will look a bit better.
It's kind of nuts to me that right now the quality of football isn't really the question. I think over the last couple of years, we've proven to get, and I don't know if this is the hard stuff or the easiest stuff, out of the way, right? Like, there's plenty of these fringe guys. I think the COVID year, from a personnel perspective, has really kind of evened out, like, with the influx of everyone. It's kind of regulating the market as far as what players and talent. I think guys have gotten better as some of these guys have realistically played football consistently from 2019 to 2023 because essentially the spring league was the alt football league of 2021 with the players are all pretty either in the NFL retired or recycled from the AAF and the XFL 2020. And I mean, right now, I think optimism is kind of lying to the wayside a little bit. And I would have liked to see a uniform release similar to the way they did it in the USFL in 2020, or excuse me, 2021 or 2022, where Colin Cowherd or whatever, it came up. They just did the thing. You saw everything instead of people's Twitter accounts or Instagram accounts and whatnot.
Yeah, there's been a lot of this, I think what you would call indirect journalism, right, when it comes to a lot of the stuff that's going on in training camp, and not just the jerseys, which has been a major element lately with some of the media days that the teams are doing and things like that. But yeah, man, I mean, there's just a lot of people that are having to dig for this information. And again, some of that information you could argue the league should be putting out themselves. As I mentioned before, the only really consistent thing that we're getting on a daily basis is transactions, guys being signed, guys being cut, guys going IR. which we'll talk about that a bit later. Yeah, man. I mean, it's just yeah, I think lack of uniformity might be a good way to put it. Now I trust the people there that things can get better. I mean, I'm trying to like recall from last year, like how it felt during training camp, which wasn't this exact time last year for the XFL at least, because again, XFL started earlier. They were already doing stuff in January, but I'm trying to kind of line things up as to where like, okay, X many weeks in the training camp for the XFL. Did we feel the same way as we do now? Is it different? It's probably a bit different, but again, like from what I recall, there wasn't a ton of access back then either. I mean, it might have been, a bit more put together because they had more time. I think the biggest element here is time. But until the kickoff comes around on March 30th, which I'll be at, I'm not expecting a ton at this point.
Do you feel like the kickoff has less Christmas Day vibes and whatnot? And shout out to Jersey the King, big fan, big subscriber, always helping out. By the way,
Yeah, I mean, I would say a bit. It kind of feels. I don't want to use that term recycled either, but again, we've been through this so many times now. Like the general hype should be that you've got the XFL champion facing off against the USFL champion. They've been able to carry that lineage into the new UFL, and I like that. But I feel like it has worn off pretty quickly since that initial announcement. Because if you remember, part of when they unveiled this new UFL at New Year's was they announced, the first game between the Stallions and the Renegades. That was kind of their draw, the one little tidbit that we got that was significant. And, that's still right now, I'd say, a pretty significant piece. But I agree, I don't think it feels the same way as last year. Like I remember, XFL kickoff last year, that felt like something completely different just because it had been, 3 years since the original XFL. And we saw, even though that was only a 5-week season, how successful that was. And again, I've gone on record saying that the XFL in 2020, I think, kind of set a standard, for the rest of these spring leagues. And that's something that they should still be trying to find now or build from.
yeah, and I like moving forward into all of it. I tell you what got me actually pretty hyped was the April 20th or whenever they kicked off the USFL, when it was like week 7 of the XFL. I actually was more hyped about that um, than I was the like the single XFL kickoff or single USFL kickoff in 22 or 23. Like having those two leagues going on at the same time, like to me, that was like that full slate of football in the spring. Like it almost felt like we were back in the fall a little bit. And I mean, I'm a little, maybe I'm just tired from work, other stuff, but I feel like I'm not losing my gourd as much. Maybe there's a vanity factor. Maybe I've accepted that if it's not the UFL, it's going to be the QFL, the Quality Football League, in 2 years. Um, arena football to me is kind of becoming more on my pipeline because I feel like there's football. I will watch it, and what I do like about the XFL and UFL is obviously it's air quote traditional. Um, and I like the fact that we are seeing guys like Luis Perez have a career instead of becoming an accountant or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really good point that you brought up, about how, last year, like you said, it was week 7 or whatever, the XFL season, you had the USFL kickoff. I mean, that was a historic day, right? I mean, you've got 16 spring football teams playing all at once, over the course of a month. I mean, we're probably never going to see that again. And I've said that before too. But yeah, I mean, really, I think the biggest thing for me now is like, we're going back to a point where there's a lot of questions. Last year in many ways felt complete. We had the USFL, we had the XFL. The ball was really rolling, again, the 16 teams. But then this merger stuff came along, and then we entered sort of that, I don't know, maybe you could call it like a foggy zone again, where you don't really know what's going on, kind of hard to see the path. And now we're sitting here, training camp's already going on, and we still have a lot of unanswered questions, and I'm not saying that that's going to directly affect the league product, but, that there is a sense of professionalism that you hope that these, or I guess this individual league now, the UFL, is able to maintain, because that's the biggest thing I think for these spring leagues is, image. I mean, they've gone through so much change and so much turmoil, and there's so many doubters. It's like you now have to operate with the highest level of professionalism because you're running out of chances to get this done the correct way. Like, I am a true believer that the UFL is the last chance for a spring league to be viable here in the US. And no doubt, if the UFL goes away, let's say somebody starts your quality football league, Pat, right? Let's say that comes
Yeah.
along, sure, people are always going to try the concept because they've seen it before. There's always going to be someone that has enough money that's interested, like a Charlie Ebersol type guy, But again, it has to be done the right way. And I feel like this now is the last time or the last opportunity where it can really be viable before we enter this era where it's just a bunch of, trial and failure that we saw, in years past, really, I guess, before the AAF in 2019.
Yeah, and I think someone will always look to it as the forbidden fruit. I think that it is too sexy of a product to not kind of mess with, if that makes sense. Um, I think on the flip side that I think it's always going to be. I just feel like you need to get some private equity in there, like true private equity, and not in the Dwayne the Rock Johnson or Charlie, what's his name, Jerry Cardinale or anything like that. But I think you need some dude, and they've talked about A-Rod. They've talked. I would like to see like a guy like Gary Vaynerchuk or Diddy, because in my opinion, you get a guy like that who air quote has something to prove because they feel like they've been wronged by the league or whatever the case is. Because remember, Diddy wanted to buy the Panthers a couple of years ago. A-Rod talked about buying the Generals. Gary Vaynerchuk has always wanted to buy the Jets. These are things that I feel like people could really get behind if done right. And if they mess up, well, maybe Redbird can invest more into other teams or whatever, if that makes sense. Like, now that, okay, your money is taking care of this team, we can focus on other teams. And to me, that could be a pretty positive thing as well. Um, you know, this is a good comment that Jack Bishop is bringing up. For those who don't follow Jack Bishop, he is essentially a Battlehawks PR manager, unofficially, by the way. So he'd be a good follow on Twitter. But I mean, he brings up that Elway, the Mannings. You go back to the original Arena Football League, who bought a lot of those teams. It was like, I don't think Kroenke did, but I think Jerry Jones bought one, if I'm not mistaken. Bon Jovi and Ron Jaworski had one. I mean, maybe they shy away from players because of Antonio Brown, but I think the man is built different. So to be fair, I don't know. I mean, look at the Vegas Knights, or the Nighthawks. Who owns that team? I believe it's a gentleman who owns the Golden Knights, right?
Correct. Yeah, Bill Foley.
Yeah, there you go. So that's kind of the guy who, in my opinion, like, that needs to be the thing, and that's my opinion on it.
Yeah. I think individual ownership would be the biggest. Yeah. I think individual ownership would be the biggest step in the right direction in terms of longevity. Like, I feel like people will be a lot more comfortable when individual owners come in and settle down in those cities. And that's kind of when you really start to realize, like, okay, these teams are here to stay if we have, an individual investor in a team, because that's the biggest. You could argue that's the biggest hurdle right now. I mean, we talk about all these little things and viewership and revenue markers, but you see a lot of these markets shifting around, and that's been something that's tested in these spring leagues is like, which markets work. I mean, some of them have been fantastic. Like, you're obviously familiar with St. Louis, and we know DC's been well. Houston's decent. I've always said Birmingham's had a lot of potential. The USFL settled in there. And they had like the Birmingham Iron, back a couple years ago. So some of these markets have become sort of spring football staples. But again, until individual ownership settles in those cities, you could say that it's difficult to determine, maybe not the future of these leagues, but again, it's always going to feel like a year to year operation if you don't have that concrete foundation, for sure.
And I don't think that's off base. And from a business perspective, I don't think that's outlandish either. Um, like, I feel that that's a similar way with the AFL and all these other arena teams where they hop ownership and whatnot. But I mean these leagues, those arena leagues, granted smaller budgets, completely different. If that's what they need to do to survive, that's I'm not really against that, and that might be just like a shilling optimist and whatnot. But Lemon V Cuts adds in: are they going to sell soon after this season? Well, I think they're. I think they're on the market, Cheech. So you got a rich uncle who wants to buy it. Go for it, my dude. But I think they're on the market. I know. Was it this year or the year before, Evan? That Mike Mitchell, who's always a good follow, by the way. He mentioned that they were looking at buying or something like that. They're looking for additional investors, and that investor word to me means very loosely as far as like what does that what does that mean? Are you looking to just buy in, or are you looking at like buying a team? So I don't know what investor means in that sense of the word.
Yeah, I wouldn't know either. I mean, my best guess would be an investor would be sort of the stepping stone towards an owner. It could kind of be like a trial run. It's like, we'll see like what, types of people and organizations might want to pump money into something like that and see if it's viable, and really get a deeper feel for the product. And then you move into individual, ownership, because the hardest thing with that, and whether it happens ever or not, it's hard to say. It's just, people who, might be interested in buying these teams are also probably aware of some of the things that we've already talked about here in the past 15 minutes in terms of stability. That's the biggest question. I mean, you're putting a lot of money on the line for something that, still might not last, many years. And I mean, you've seen that in the arena and indoor level too. Keep in mind, those are smaller budgets, and that's something I have a closer tie to now working in the indoor football league. But, on a larger scale, it's like you have to understand, like, things shift a lot in this space. And even if you're an individual owner, something could happen with the league, and then, pieces move around, and it could become really messy real quick. And that's not going to help, with the image at all if you don't have the right owner who, does things the wrong way. And I mean, you see that at multiple different levels of football. Going back to the arena comparison, I mean, one of the headlines last year in all of sports ownership came from the arena level in the National Arena League with Antonio Brown. And as a result, that team folded, and now they've come back as the Albany Firebirds in the new AFL, or revived AFL, I guess you'd say. But again, that's a completely new endeavor, a new league. There's some questions there too. So it's the bottom line for me is like, I wouldn't say that buying these teams is a direct risk, but there has to be a certain assessment done there. And I think, you still might have to keep pumping money into this from like just a general perspective for a couple years before you're going to have individual owners or even just general investors, like I was talking about earlier, that come in and say, hey, like let's give this a shot. Like, let's make sure that this team is here to stay. So.
And Chris Mason kind of threw a curveball into this, so maybe we would have had a Michigan Panthers investor, but yeah, his rich uncle donated 99% of his $4 million to the church, so we kind of struck out on the Michigan investing and whatnot. But Evan, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people are charlatans and whatnot. In my opinion, I would have rather seen a guy like Destroying buy a football team rather than play on one, especially my feelings towards not only Matt Amendola but Chris Dunn as well, and my connections towards that. Quick sidebar real quick, guys, we are at 71 viewers. I think my record is 80. A little bit of self promo here. I'm 15 subscribers away from 1K. If you're watching this on YouTube and whatnot, please subscribe, please like. By the way, by Evan Wilsmore is his handle. I'll remove the banner in a second so you guys can check him out as well. But getting back on track with that, yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of vetting that needs to be done, and we're getting some of those in the comments and whatnot. How would ownership work if they have an XFL hub system? They wouldn't. They would have to. I think they would have to go into the city, or if the guy lives in Omaha, guess what? Omaha Nighthawks run it back. that's my opinion on that front. Do you feel any different? And that's going to be a banned word, Chris. We can't use the word expansion anymore.
You're funny, Pat. No, I think with the XFL hub system, I mean, yeah, I think their goal too is like if the investors were to come in, like that Arlington hub, at least for training camp and all the operations, like guys wouldn't be going back there in season. They want to have a permanent, place in those markets. And a lot of people, don't care for the Arlington hub format and having to travel to all the home games. It just adds a logistical element to it, and for the players, it's more difficult. You saw that in the XFL last year where, guys who were going to DC and Seattle, they were put at a disadvantage. I mean, that's a long way from Arlington. But again, all this stuff that you're seeing right now, it's cost cutting measures. Everything in these leagues comes down to money. And that's what you have to remember. That's why we're probably having this continued discussion about investors and private ownership, because that's pumping more money into the league. But right now, they're operating on a pretty tight budget, and everybody brings up, the Rock lost $60 million, that figure that came out after the XFL season last year. So, these leagues are extremely hard to maintain from a financial perspective. That's why a lot of them fail, because people, it's not that they don't have money, it's just they don't, I mean, in some cases, maybe they don't have money, but
Yeah,
sometimes I think they just don't. They just don't do a general assessment of how much things really cost. Like if you think about it, one player contract is, what, over 50 grand. I mean, that's for one player on one team. You know,
yeah. Depending on the player, yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And that's like,
Yeah,
that's kind of a base price. And then you're going up from there. Kind of like when you go to a car dealership, it's like the car's for sale for 25 grand. But by the time you put taxes and options on top of that, it's like a 40 grand car. So that's something to think about as well.
yeah. And Lemon, I hope that answered your question. Just to paraphrase, teams, I assume, ownership would be responsible for taking those players and then housing or not housing them. I think paying them a wage that they could live in their markets. Because maybe the first year, if it was me, I'd put them up in a hotel and I'd be like, hey man, like you're on a 3-year deal. I'm paying you X amount of dollars. Figure it out, Cheech. Like St. Louis making 70 grand, you could find a decent spot in the county and whatnot. Obviously, you're asking people to move, but people move for jobs all the time for 70 G's, man. And I hate to be that guy, but it is the reality of not only professional sports, but life as well. And how many guys move in on the practice squad where they make 8 grand a week and they get cut the next day. And I know on several NFL teams, they only put you up in a hotel for 2 weeks. So take that for what it's worth. Evan, just want to get any final thoughts on that before we get into some of these roster moves. I really wanted to hear you vocalize your take about Preston Williams and kind of this pseudo analysis as well. And after that, I do want to get the Jack's comment because I do agree with some of what he's about to say.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think the last thing, that I'll touch on here before we get into specific UFL player stuff, one of the points that you brought up earlier about, indoor arena football kind of making a comeback and they've got the individual owners, you know, I've gone on record saying that I think the sport, I mean, it peaked in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s, into the mid 2000s, whatever. There was like a 10-year period where that was really trending. But I think now, you see some of these leagues, and again, the indoor space changes more than even the UFL space. It's a completely different, different level of operations there. But I think you're right. There is, in my opinion, and of course I'm biased because I work for an indoor team, but I think I think there is a bit of a comeback, and depending on whether or not this relaunched AFL can succeed. I mean, there's a chance between the AFL and the IFL, which would be considered the top two levels of indoor and arena football in the United States. That would be 32 teams. In pro football. Now, again, smaller budgets, different game. I understand it's not traditional at all, but that's a lot of opportunities, and again, the UFL, or well, I guess the XFL really before the merger was the one that was pushing the whole, I call it the player development narrative, the player 54 stuff. And, I've talked about that ad nauseum, so I'm not going to, really talk about it here, but, without doing too much of a self promo, like if you're looking for an opportunity, I mean, some good stuff, going on down in the indoor game, and I think I think there is room to grow there as well. So just
Yeah,
something to think about as well while we're talking about all this football stuff.
no, I totally agree with you, and I think whether they call it the IFL, the NAL, the AFL, whatever you call it, I think, and that's what I kind of like about the arena leagues is that because those teams flop, they figure it out. Like whether it's 6 teams, whether it's 106 teams, if they have stable ownership, you will be playing football. And I mean, I personally feel you got someone involved like Bill Foley, who also owns the GH the AHL hockey team. I think what they're doing in Massachusetts is on a different level, and sometimes it's not pretty linear to what the league wants, obviously, but different conversation. I think what's the team up in Moline?
Quad
The
City.
Quad City. I think Quad City's got a pretty good thing. Shout out to Omar. I talked to him today a little bit, trying to get one of my guys up there. Let's see what happens.
Omar's great, man. That's the guy. That's the
Yeah,
guy.
yeah. So I mean, I think there's plenty of that. Jack, before we get into like the last couple of transactions and whatnot, Jack brings up a really good point, which I don't see how a league could say no. Like, you think that they could sponsor people, get the people to sponsor them, similar to what you see in low level baseball. Um, the sponsor family very became very famous during the Freddie Prinze Jr. movie Summer Catch, for good and bad. But yeah, I definitely see that happening. I think Jack just wants to have Darius Shepard move into his house personally. But I mean, I live 45 minutes away from where they would practice, where the Rams used to practice. So if someone wants to make that drive, I'm sure Ashley would have no problem housing a football player. If worldwide technology dishes out some dollars. But staying on that, um, transitioning a little bit to the recent transactions, biggest thing that pops out to me is this injury situation. We already I do want to hear your thoughts on the wide receiver situation for DC, especially before we get into our top 10 players and all that goofy stuff. But what are you making of these injuries? I'm trying to figure out like what's going on as far as the um, like injured reserve situation, because I know a lot of people are getting their news from personal players from like Instagram. I haven't really been on the gram that much recently, just because I don't know. I just don't feel like it. Something I did see is Johnny Buchanan, who we follow each other and whatnot. He posted a picture of him leaving Arlington. He was placed on injured reserve. He was in the gym working out with Ronnie Coleman. So I don't really know what his status is, but he did make a post saying my season is over. So I'm a little confused on that part. And then obviously Ja'Cour Pearson, who I was told he had a sprained PCL, out for 6 weeks. So be back week 3, week 4 maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is, again, like some of these injuries we don't have a lot of details on. The most two that are significant right now, I think, Garrett McGinn was first with Arlington, and then you had Ja'Cour Pearson after that. Um, the one thing that I always say, just in general, about spring league injuries and why it might even be more unfortunate than if you were injured in another league, whether it's NFL or indoor. It's only a 10-week season, right? And when you're trying to get game film, you're trying to get reps, even if you only end up missing 3 or 4 weeks, that's really significant. And like there were guys like one guy that I'll talk about later in the show when we get to our top players list or whatever, like Tim Ward, with the Roughnecks. Like I think he missed maybe half the season or a couple games at the end, got banged up, and it just wasn't the same. But like, that was the difference, I think, between that guy being right next to Trent Harris, who's another guy that I'll talk about, and him, not fading into irrelevancy, because him and Trent are now back on the same team in DC. But again, things got a lot quieter after that. Houston's run slowed down a bit. So those things add up, and I feel like especially for Ja'Cour Pearson in particular, like he was a guy that I was shocked, I would say, that didn't even, go to an NFL minicamp, let alone a contract or, get preseason reps. I mean, no team even really batted an eye. I'm sure there were some people that were maybe talking to him. But, it was a pretty quiet offseason for him. And, I think he's got a lot to prove this year. But again, if you're, even if you're only missing 3 or 4 weeks in a 10-week season, I mean, that feels like, critical time that's gone, and it sucks. And that's just the nature of this business that makes it a bit different than other areas in football. So my heart goes out to everybody that's been injured. You brought up Johnny Buchanan. I actually wasn't familiar with his injury, but he was somebody that I talked to over the summer, and he reached out to me asking for advice about, the XFL in particular. Keep in mind, this was before the merger. So me and him, I remember, had a pretty nice chat. It was brief, but I pointed him in the right direction. And obviously he ended up being drafted by the Battlehawks. And I think he's an outstanding player as well. I was pushing his film and some of his other stuff out to certain coaches. So unfortunate for him, unfortunate for Jakur and Garrett and all these other guys that we're seeing popping up on IR. But it's football. Injuries happen. I'm just hoping that, again, there's less of those, hopefully none, throughout the rest of camp, especially. And again, too, you got to think, I mean, from, I guess it's Sunday when they do the first cuts, there's going to be a lot less guys, at camp moving forward, because they got to go from, 75 to 58. So a lot of moves coming up here, and we'll get into some of that.
Yeah, and I mean, Johnny Buchanan, obviously a very muscular linebacker. So it's someone that, I always have hesitations on as far as his lateral quickness and whatnot. And are the muscles too big for the joints and whatnot? I was really high on Buchanan, kind of becoming a big run stopper and whatnot. My biggest thing was always going to be, now that they added the merger and everything, does that guy kind of have to wait a little bit? Whether it's a guy like Mike Rose going to the NFL, or realizing that he doesn't want to play in the spring football for the rest of his life. If the NFL kind of moves him by, then that's Buchanan's shot to move up. But I mean, Garrett McGinn, by the way, I had someone tell me it was the inevitable one, that it was a torn meniscus. So McGinn should be back, from what I was told and whatnot. The Pearson thing was weird because I didn't, and I pointed it out to someone. I was like, no knee brace, no foot, no boot. Excuse me, no boot on the foot. No ice, no nothing. He was wearing a calf. He was wearing a light sleeve, so I thought it was a calf issue. You see a lot of guys wear that. He didn't, and he doesn't wear leggings during practice. So, I mean, we'll see on that. Also, DC had an injury as well. Sam Kidd, safety. Not really familiar with him, to be honest, so my apologies on that. But we do see these moves happening, man, nonstop. I mean, the constant retool. A guy like Cam Sutton getting an opportunity for Memphis. He was with Vegas last year. Guys like Toby Johnson reporting to camp. Damian Daniels, who was cut, he's with Michigan now, so that might tell you something of an injury going on. A lot of fluidity right now, for lack of a better term. And, I mean, teams are cutting guys and whatnot. Curtis Johnson had some good tidbits as far as their quarterback situation, which kind of put a damper. I was going to make Reed Zinnette shirts, and I was going to go fly to Houston and sell them outside the stadium. So I don't know how many of those I could sell now, but I think I'm still going to make them, and I'll ask one of my boys on the Roughnecks to, maybe get a Royal Retros deal going. I don't know.
You've always got something creative going on, man. I love it. But yeah, there's some interesting situations playing out. I was actually going to hop on that Roughnecks media call. I had some other stuff going on. I didn't get around to it, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'll elaborate that on that quickly, and then I want to get to you mentioned the defenders, wide receivers. I want to talk about that too. Yeah, it's interesting. So right now, I think the two guys there that are getting a lot of attention, it's Reed Sinnett, obviously, and Jarrett Guarantano. And his name, Guarantano, was actually floated around a lot last year in the spring league space. A lot of people were kind of expecting him to, come around. And I'm not sure if he was one of the guys that worked with Jordan Palmer or not, but
He
yeah, there
did.
was there was some kind of connection there that his name
Yeah.
was popping up a lot, and I thought he was a good fit. So it's good to see that he's found a spot with the Roughnecks now, and it sounds like he's going to play this season. And then yeah, man, the other thing I was going to talk about, like you had brought up earlier, was the defenders wide receiver room. I think you wanted me to get into some of the Preston Williams stuff, but just in
Yeah.
general first, uh, you know, it's kind of a good lead into what we're about to do with the top players. But yeah, man, I think that group in particular, the defenders wide receiver room, might be the most intriguing room in the entire UFL. I like to say the rich get richer. I mean, man, shout out to Vaughn Hutchins. That guy knows how to work a roster, no doubt. He's assembled. I'm not going to sing the defenders' praises too much because they haven't taken a snap yet, but you're going to see on my list there's a lot of defenders players, and I think Vaughn, you know, he went out there early and he made some big swings early, right? But this wide receiver room with the defenders, I feel like they just they had Preston Williams leave, who was kind of their big acquisition. He had 7 touchdowns in the NFL, was with the Dolphins for a couple years. They brought in Kiki QT, who was with Colts, Texans. Guy almost has 1,000 career receiving yards in the NFL. They've got John Hightower, who was an NFL draft pick, played in a couple games. I think they've got Kelvin Harmon, who had like 30 catches in the NFL. So again, just a really intriguing group. And I think there's one other NFL guy I forgot, Vincent Smith, who they just added like 2 days ago, who's I think he's a D2 guy. Was on the practice squad circuit for a couple years. Those guys really, they just keep bringing them in. Like Isaiah Coulter, I think, was kind of their replacement, and that's another NFL draft pick. I mean, it's just the NFL pedigree. We talk a lot about that in these leagues. Guys that have been drafted, have played snaps in the NFL. They're the ones that always get the more attention. And I don't know if I've seen a room like this in the spring league yet, where you have so many NFL draft picks, some of which have played in games. Some of them are veterans, some of them aren't. Some of them are more fresh. But man, I feel like there's a lot to work with there for Jordan Teamu. And without giving too much away, we'll get into him later as well.
Yeah, I mean, Teamu, especially those first 2 weeks when he played, looked so uncomfortable, to now with him having another year with Fred Keiss and that staff. I don't see that drop off as far as like Teamu, like to me, was not the guy for the first 2 weeks. And then I could definitely see him like kind of like full steam ahead and whatnot. Had a little bit of work with the Vikings, obviously, but for me, like I think that's kind of a positive because there was such a break for him that he kind of like got those extra reps against better players and whatnot. That could add more tools to the toolbox. Staying on the DC train, I mean, they haven't signed any other specialists, so I think it's full Matt McCrane season until it's not type thing. So, but overall, I mean, I hate saying it because we just kind of always say it when we talk about these rosters, like the rich get richer, the rich get richer. And it's like all these teams are improved. Someone that always talk about too is Puka Williams. If he can kind of get it together a little bit, we could definitely see some massive improvement there. And Brian Webster, who I'm pretty sure that's Webb from United Football Media and whatnot, completely right. You got a guy like, when you're looking at this roster and you got a guy like Chris Rowland, who you're like, oh, that could be our number 4, number 3. You're in a pretty good place, especially when you not only lose, Lucky Jackson, Chris Blair, and then Josh Hammond. All 3 signed NFL contracts. Shout out to Al Vance Robinson, who's now coaching, I think, at West Georgia. You have that pedigree. Like, I feel like you're in a pretty good place.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you're starting to see. I mean, the biggest question from the personnel side, I think, in the new UFL, and at least for me, that was something that I've been following now for a couple months, with all the dispersal drafts and things like that. are these rosters really going to be as complete as we want them to be? Because when you're going from 16 teams to 8, the idea is that you're kind of filtering through the talent to get the best guys available. And initially, I didn't know. I was looking at some of the stuff and I'm like, well, they're retaining a lot of these guys, some of whom I think could have been better. There's a lot of guys who I think, carry weight, but they just haven't shown it yet. Like the potential's there, but there's a lot to prove. Puka Williams is a great example of that. The other guy I bring up all the time is Calvin Turner, who's still with the Brahmas, who's one of my favorite players, again, in terms of you talk about ceiling. So yeah, guys like that. And then, you've got obviously the crop of, younger guys who maybe this is their first time playing, pro ball, some of the small schoolers, who weren't around last year, these names that were picked up in the rookie drafts. I know Mark Lillybridge, who I, obviously had ties with, and he was with the Roughnecks, who's now in San Antonio, has quite a few of those guys, that he brought in through the rookie draft, and, some interesting names. Some of those guys weren't retained. But again, I think it's going to be a healthy mix. I think there are some guys who are getting the right opportunity. And then you've also got, as I mentioned before, like a ton of NFL names, who are giving it a second chance.
Evan, do you feel that for the next 2 years, if let's say this league stays around for 5 years, and I want to hear people's thoughts on this in the comments if you can, do you feel in the next 2 years that, and I talked about this with Reed, I think last year, that we are going to be in a bubble as far as like purging NFL talent? And in baseball, they use the term 4A, where a guy can't play in the major leagues, but he crushes AAA. Do you feel that we are essentially going to purge talent from the NFL for guys like maybe a Preston Williams who got there because he was off the year before and realized, hey, this ain't it, Cheech? Because when I talked to Joey Ivy, when Joey got done with the USFL, when Joey got signed to the Gamblers, he straight up told me, he was like, bro, I was out of shape. Like, I just kind of was, I had like 2 workouts during the 2021 season, and I was kind of, whatchamacallit, I was kind of just doing my thing and whatnot as well. And then they called, and I was like, yeah, sure. Let's make this happen, for lack of a better term. Didn't really train that hard. And then got offered with the Roughnecks, or it was the Roughnecks or the Guardians, whichever Gamblers coach went to Houston or went to the XFL, that defensive line coach. And it kind of got to the point where, because Joey, as a fringe NFL guy, he played in 10 NFL games, made over $1 million playing NFL football over 4 years. He was kind of at the point where it's like, bro, I ain't trying to do this anymore. Like this, like, I know I got to move to the next phase of my career. I'm glad I could still perform, but like Joey had 4.5 sacks in like 6 games as an interior defensive lineman.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you talk about like bringing in guys from the NFL. I think there's always a desire to do that. And the best thing about bringing in guys from the NFL is it's better for fan engagement. Like you look at last year, you had Vic Beasley, Josh Gordon. Those are all names that are, familiar to NFL fans. I mean, Vic Beasley's still in the UFL right now with Arlington. He was in Vegas last year. But yeah, I think my hope is that, keep bringing in the NFL talent, guys that have, again, like I said, been on the practice squad circuit, maybe have been, sort of like kind of how Kyle Sloter was hailed as the preseason god, guys that like get these unofficial reps. I think that's important. But at the same time, like I was talking about earlier, I think it's really important to, do some, I don't know if the right term is like true scouting, because I know these guys are putting in a lot of work, but, it's easy to just kind of grab these names out of the NFL bucket. It's like, okay, well, I can look at this roster and be like, this guy would be a good fit, because he hasn't played in so long and has only had so many games, so many snaps. But my hope is that, like, and I do this is kind of my philosophy in the indoor league too. You want to have balance. Like, it's always good to have the veteran leadership, the guys that have been in the NFL or the CFL that carved out decent careers. But I also like the guys that you haven't heard a lot about, some Division II guy who, put up insane numbers and has, some decent testing, but never really made it past the mini camp or something like that, and that's the stuff that I feel like, you talk about opportunities in these leagues. I feel like they still have to make a push to bring those guys in and at least give them a chance. Now, I understand they still might not have the higher odds of making it through training camp onto a final roster, but in my opinion, it's just really cool, in these leagues when you have like such, that, like I said, diverse spread from like Power 5 through NAIA, and, whether a guy's been in the NFL for 5 seasons or this is his first time playing pro football. I'll never get enough of that. And again, if this league, does stay around for a couple more years, I hope that's something they continue to work on. And I'm not saying they've done a poor job with it. I just want to, make sure it keeps going.
Yeah, and I think NIL actually helps this, in my opinion, because you get a guy who is like Cam Ward, who is graded as a 5th-round pick, but he's making so much money in college. Now I can get the Nolan Henderson from Delaware, see how he does. One of these weird guys, like Kenji Bahar was a good example. Kenji Bahar, FCS guy, was a fringe, played with the Ravens on their practice squad. I think society, like the football society, needs to see Kenji Bahar, because I don't want to see Jake Fromm, after 7 years in the NFL, finally play because he's just been in the system and whatnot. Now we know Kenji Bahar could not play at the NFL level, but we've kind of negated to an extent from the environment of football. Like, okay, the guy got his opportunity, it didn't work out. Who's next? Reed Sinnett now, because Reed Sinnett was going on that track. Reed Sinnett, if this league never existed, would probably be on practice squads and futures contracts, and then probably 2026 have to start a playoff game. And and Lemon Cuts brings up a good point. What about Paxton Lynch? Well, I think
I was just thinking about him. That's so funny. That was the other name I was going to bring up.
I think everyone could agree Paxton Lynch's situation in Denver was not advantageous, and I think he was thrown to the wolves and whatnot. Goes to Canada. It's kind of in that weird, you need a vaccine to go to this place but not that place. I think there were some issues with that. He plays in the USFL. I think he played way better than his stat line. Got another opportunity with Orlando. Granted, wasn't the best situation. I think he's a lot better. He probably should have stayed in Michigan, in my opinion, because him and Coach Eric Marty love each other. And then from there, he's a Florida guy. Wants to be in Florida, probably not Birmingham or Detroit. And then from there, apparently he didn't hit the bill, and people are like, that's kind of the MO on this. So I don't think we could look at a guy like Paxton Lynch's career and be like, oh, he never got an opportunity. I mean, were the cards stacked against him? And I think about, with Denver and Orlando, yeah, I think they were. But in the end, he went to San Antonio, could have played there, and he didn't. They didn't see. They threw Luis Perez in there with a week in, and who are they trotting out there? Jawan Pass and Kurt Benkert? I mean, I think that says a lot, in my opinion.
Yeah. Man, that was a great summary. I got nothing else to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, same thing with Josh Love. I think Josh Love should be in this league. I think
endless examples.
Yeah, I mean, there's examples upon examples. Love was a practice squad guy and got an opportunity. I do think he is one of the top 24 non-NFL spring league quarterbacks on the market, but we'll see what happens. Trace McSorley, maybe we get some of that, mid-season or right before camp.
You're starting to see some of these names that are brought up again. Like the two big ones have been Trace McSorley and Kellen Mond, and I'm pretty sure both of those guys were just thrown at the combine. Kellen Mond in particular is a fascinating one to me. I think, I think he could be one of these guys that comes into a spring league and really does some interesting things. I say that because he's a bit younger than McSorley. Like McSorley's played in a couple NFL games, I think with the Ravens and the Cardinals, originally drafted by the Ravens, right? So, he's had a bit more of that. Whereas, again, Kellen Mond comes in, higher pick, and it just felt like, I don't want to say, it's a bit rude to say the guy's career felt over right off the bat, but you were hearing some things and you looked at his stuff in the preseason, and then suddenly you really didn't hear really anything from him for a while. So that's a guy that I feel like could really use this opportunity, and maybe more so than some of these. We've really coined the term fringe whether it's quarterbacks or just NFL players in general. But a guy like that really stands out to me.
Yeah, I mean, Kellen Mond was the second string for a little bit with the Vikings, and then they opted to start Sean Mannion over him, who's Sean Mannion's career highlight is a deflected pass that Garrett Bradbury caught the center and ran for 23 yards or something like that on a cold Vikings day. So when Kirk Cousins, I don't believe he had COVID, but he was in the vicinity of someone. Quick comment on this: is Perez QB1? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, they brought him back late. Him and Teamu were kind of the last ads, and AJ McCarron was a bit before that. Again, we're going to talk about all these guys shortly, but I don't see. I mean, Perez, like, he's become, in a sense, I mean, you could really argue he's the poster child, in these spring leagues. He's started pretty much everywhere, even in TSL, right? Even in one of these leagues that, I know you and me both really like, Pat, and probably a league that doesn't get enough recognition for the things that it did during a time where, there really wasn't anything happening besides CFL, right? I mean, that was the league in 2021. It was kind of that bridge between XFL 2020 and the USFL in 2022. So I won't go on about that because, that's like a 4-hour, I'm going to be sitting here for a while if we get too excited about TSL. But that's, man, that's something to think about. Sure.
Yeah, and I mean, we are going to produce the Luis Perez documentary at some point, and we'll be putting his bust in the Hall of Fame if he eclipses 10,000 career yards. In my opinion, he will get to the Hall of Fame. In my opinion, I don't know if I have to buy the bust and put him there myself, but I think that's going to be a good documentary I make.
I think everybody that follows these leagues would vouch for that.
Yeah. I mean, that would be, I think, one of the greatest things we could probably do. Evan, any final thoughts before we get into our top 10 players or anything like that? Anything that's come off on your radar or anything like that?
I mean, there's been some great questions. I appreciate the engagement here for Pat, and we're getting his channel hopefully to 1K soon. So I would just keep it up. We're getting into some deeper stuff here now. So
yeah, I mean, we're 142 people watching, man. Like, I'm extremely grateful. Like, that's amazing. If you're on YouTube or if you're watching this on Twitter, if you can go to YouTube, hit subscribe, get us to 1K. We're pretty close to the watch hours. The goal is to pay my electric bill with this. Obviously, you guys know I am not home right now. We're traveling throughout the country working. But, we do have some interviews back in studio when we do get back. So there should be some couple guests, a couple college coaches and whatnot. God willing, Evan and I can link up one of these days, and we'll do an interview with that in person because I like talking to people in person. I'll make Evan take a Zenachino and and push on with that. But yeah, so the main part of this video, I think there was a bunch of random stuff that came up, was always to talk about my top 10 players going into this year. Last year, I did it as well. I wrote 2 articles for the one for the USFL, one for the XFL. Got to give this man a shout out here, Matt Seibert. If you don't know who Matt is, Matt is a tight end from Michigan State, played in the spring league, played with the Chargers, then spent the last 2 years with the Pittsburgh Maulers. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, got hurt in 2022. And in 2023, I personally felt Matt took that step forward, got a lot more comfortable, kind of got a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of wasn't able to maximize his potential, and it had nothing to do with this player, a player named Mason Stockey. Stockey's a great H-back, fullback, and whatnot, but Matt definitely, if you watch the tape, solid player, and you know what I love about him? He plays special teams.
Yeah, shout out to Matt. Great guy. Interacted with him a couple of times. I appreciate you watching, man. That's always good to see players come on, and it shows that we're making the right impact. So
yeah, we're doing the half decent stuff. So I'm gonna go on my share screen real quick. We're gonna pull it up real here. I'm getting real big into Canva right now. So let me just pull it up real quick so y'all can see it. Um, pull it up. There we go. So big thing we talked about, top 10 players, all that stuff. I'm obviously starting it off. I got Cody Latimer. My personal preference for Cody Latimer is he was one of those guys that we probably didn't love. That we were a little bit like, what's this guy doing? Yeah, he won a Super Bowl. Yeah, he was a decent wide receiver with the Broncos and whatnot. But then all of a sudden, this guy's playing tight end and he's making Paxton Lynch look like a All American again. Back thinking we're in our Memphis days and whatnot. Which, fun fact, Paxton Lynch played with Joey Magnifico, who was his tight end there, and then they played together in Michigan, in the Michigan Panthers of Birmingham. So fun knowledge there. All XFL tight end in 2023. My personal opinion, I think the career is for the NFL is over. I think we could have a swan song here, but if they kind of get their stuff together regarding like financials and whatnot, Cody Latimer is not a guy is a guy that I could see kind of just doing his thing and collecting his 70 grand paychecks for the next couple of years and then moving on. Like anything crazy on that front.
Yeah, man. I mean, Latimer on my own list, I had him as an honorable mention. I mean, what he did with the Guardians last year, I feel like he was, I don't want to say carried him because, they had Quentin Dormady and some guys on defense that were putting in work. I understand it was a difficult season, but yeah, I mean, Cody's one of these guys. He comes in, he's an NFL veteran, he's got a ton of experience, won a Super Bowl, knows Wade Phillips, which is obviously why he's in San Antonio now. I remember Wade was posting about him last season, thought that was really cool to draw a connection. Like, hey, years ago we were with the Broncos. Now we're doing stuff in the XFL. Like, it's really cool. Now, with my own list, I just want to preface it by saying I obviously spent more time around the XFL. So, full disclosure, I've probably got a couple more XFL players on there than USFL. I tried to be fair. I definitely have a few USFL players. But, I'm going off what I know best. And the reality is creating a top 10 player list now when the talent pool, in my opinion, has overall, it's increased because, again, we talked about narrowing down that pool. It was really difficult to create a proper top 10. So I did my best. I've got some honorable mentions at the end. Like I said, Cody's one of them, so that gives it away. I don't think the other guys that I had, on the honorable mentions list match up with Pat. So we'll kind of, go back and forth with the players. There'll be a couple I know, like on the main list that that overlap or whatever, but obviously we got a lot to say. So,
Yeah. And who did you have at number 10? Real
yeah, I
quick.
had Matt Corral with the
Oh,
Birmingham Stallions, and I understand that's gonna, maybe ruffle some feathers, right? And I put him at 10 because he hasn't played a snap in the league yet. But I'm gonna explain my reasoning here. So Matt Corral, drafted in the third round in 2022 by the Carolina Panthers. So less than 2 years ago, which is crazy. Drafted by the Panthers, we obviously know that maybe isn't the most stable organization in the NFL. Has a Liz Frank injury, I believe, in the preseason.
yeah.
Is out all 20, misses his entire rookie season, which when you're a quarterback, even if he wasn't projected to start, that sucks. And I think that, he's a guy that maybe could have got some playing time. I see a lot of potential in him. We'll get into more of that later. Going into 2023, he's part of final roster cuts. He's picked up by the Patriots, but then he's put on like the did not report list. Not sure what happened there. So he was like kind of with the Patriots, kind of wasn't. So his 2023 was interesting. The bottom line is his NFL career thus far has been very forgettable. He's done nothing really in the NFL. And, that's unfortunate. But again, that's the purpose of these leagues. A guy comes in and he rehabs. And I'll say this too. The reality is Matt Corral probably isn't even going to be starting for the Stallions. I think it's Jamar Smith's job to lose. We saw what he did in that first USFL season in 2022. Last year, he got hurt. Alex Magoo takes over. Great season and is now still with the Green Bay Packers going on to, a second deal. I think he's on a reserve future contract right now. Yeah, so Matt Corral, I bring up his name and I put him on this list because, again, extremely high ceiling, even if he's not the starter. I hope he gets reps. And even if it's minimal, I still feel like he's one of these guys where because he's in the UFL, he's practicing every week, he's staying healthy, he's staying active. I feel like when, I understand the UFL ends a bit later, and that's a separate discussion, the sort of timeline for guys going to the NFL. But I feel like he will have NFL teams inquiring about him, just because he's only 25 years old. Again, really felt like he never had the right opportunity. He was injured, went to a difficult situation. The one thing that I wonder about Matt Corral, too, and this is aside from, again, him as a player, just kind of one of those things that you kind of sit there late at night and you're like, damn, like that's interesting. In 2022, Matt Corral, this was his rookie season when he was hurt. He was teammates with PJ Walker. We all know who PJ Walker is, XFL legend, I would say, from 2020. In those 5 games, he, just performed. I mean, best quarterback play I think we've seen in spring football, arguably. I mean, there's a couple guys that are getting there all time, and obviously you track that better than anybody, Pat. But my point being, Matt Corral was with the Panthers. He was teammates with PJ Walker. And I really wonder if PJ Walker, I wonder if they shared some stories about the XFL, and maybe it's something that Matt Corral thought about, when he was in talks with the Stallions. And again, this is all just not anything I know. It's just pure speculation. But I bring that up because, the whole story with PJ Walker initially was he was on the Colts practice squad forever, like 3 seasons. He just sat there, wasn't doing anything. Again, pretty forgettable guy in the grand scheme of things. But he was sitting there and he was teammates. Obviously, Andrew Luck was the starter, the guy in front of him, or a couple spots in front of him. And he said, hey, PJ, like, my dad, Oliver, is involved with the XFL. Like, I think this would be a great opportunity for you. Why don't you go check that out? So I really wonder if PJ was like, hey, Matt, like if things don't work out for you here, man, or like, obviously you're still very early in your career, but, with the injury and like then he gets cut, it's like you wonder if like, maybe PJ was like, well, look at this as an option. And again, I can't guarantee that, but I know PJ has spoken about the XFL very highly in the past, after I believe he was there, when he was in the NFL, which has been forever now. So that's a bit of a tangent, but that's my thoughts on Matt Corral. I think he's one of the most intriguing guys in the UFL right now. Had to put him on the list, even if he's not going to play that much.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of crazy to always say it, but you can have guys just kind of get the pedigree of like, film connection with coaches and whatnot. Like that's very real possibility that we do see Matt Corral return to the NFL despite only throwing 4 passes and whatnot. Something to just Jersey the King brings up real quick. How many QBs coming out of the draft will not be drafted, but possibly in the UFL next season? I mean, it comes down to their, what Nolan Henderson and Tom Flacco and Chase Garbers all do in camp. Like, even if they don't play, do they, get rid of those guys? Like we see, I'm sure, what's his name? Guy Myers will get signed and then cut again. I'm sure that will happen. It just comes down to what the, roster spots are, what guys, is Tom Flacco, who is a bit older. I think he's a 2020 or 2019 guy. Is he going to want to keep doing this? Is he going to want to deal with it? If the Battlehawks win a championship, you think AJ McCarron comes back? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's so many different factors that, in my opinion, like to put a number on it would be unreasonable. I didn't think Reed Sinnett would be a Houston Roughneck. I think we all kind of thought that he was going to be pushing on that. But moving on to number 9, we jacked that up.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. I mean, moving to number 9, I got Vontae Diggs, man. I kind of see him as that like jack linebacker and whatnot, very athletic, played with the Legends, played in the CFL, coming up on 200 career tackles with the Showboats. And the reason why is I didn't have him on the list originally. And then I talked to Carnell Lake earlier this week. And Carnell Lake is the defensive coordinator for the Memphis Showboats. And what I loved about Lake is realizing that his connection to the Steelers and Dick LeBeau and all that good stuff, and the fact that he's able, in my opinion, to kind of put a guy like this into such an athletic position with the pieces around him, that I think we could see finally Vontae getting over he's been a fringe all league player constantly. And I think we can get him to because they run this like fire zone type stuff where they're constantly rushing five guys. That's something the Steelers have done for years and whatnot, and they'll drop into like a weird cover three or something like that. And I think a guy like Diggs could really maximize his pass rushing and get kind of the sexy stats that people who make the league and whatnot, they probably pay attention to it as well. Diggs is going to be 30. If not, he is 30. But at the same time, nothing but love for this guy. And I forgot where he went to college, but I think he's an FCS guy. I don't remember. No, he went to UConn. So group of five guy.
Yeah, I mean, hey, great analysis, Pat. I saw Vontae Diggs on your list, and I thought that was interesting. I really wanted to hear your explanation for him. I feel like he's definitely good. Like I've watched him again, just one of these kind of quieter guys. Like he's older, but yeah, I definitely think he's starting to become one of these staples in spring football. And he was a guy I remember. I remember looking at in 22 when he was still with the Breakers, and I was like, I like what I see here. My number 9 was another guy that hasn't played in the league yet, and again, that's why I'm putting these guys a bit lower on my list because we haven't actually seen them. But Jalen Samuels with the San Antonio Brahmas. Now, for those who don't know, Jalen Samuels was a 5th-round draft pick by the Pittsburgh Steelers in, I believe, 2018. He's a running back. One of 2 former Steelers running backs that the Brahmas have, interestingly enough. The other one is, I think his name is Anthony McFarland Jr. Yeah, so they've got 2 former Steelers guys. I picked Jalen Samuels for a specific reason, and that's because in the NFL, he has more receiving yards than rushing yards. And if you know how A.J. Smith runs his offense and some of the running backs that have been with him before, I think of James Butler in 2020, who was more of a pure runner, but then Max Borghi last year, who was the true, I don't know if you'd call him a two-way guy, but in terms of running and catching the ball, he was great at both. Unfortunately, Max is no longer in the league. He was with the Battlehawks, didn't want to play. You've been over all that. But yeah, I look at Jalen Samuels. He's a bit of a bigger back than Max Borghi. Again, I think he's kind of built more like a pure runner. He's bigger than James Butler as well. I think he's 6 foot 225, so he's got an inch or two on. I don't know. He's definitely got an inch or two over Borghi. I don't remember what Butler's numbers are. I love James, by the way. I should probably know where he's standing at because I was just with him a couple months ago at Grey Cup. But yeah, man, Jalen Samuels. Again, I just look at his game and I'm like, with the NFL pedigree combined by how running backs are used in that offense, I think he has a really good opportunity here to do something. And again, a great mentor to guys like, Bryson Aline, who I think obviously, I mean, he's a lot smaller in terms of frame, but, pass catching, shifty back. I feel like, those guys share things in common. But again, what really does it for me and why I put Jalen on this list is because he proved himself as a very good pass catching back in the NFL with a frame, that's more towards a power runner, I guess you would call it, a guy that wouldn't be catching the football and doing stuff like that. So I don't know. Like I'm not a coach like Pat is at the college level, so I can't talk about ball the same way. But I do know a thing or two about players, and I'll tell you, I like Jalen a lot. So hopefully he has a role this season. He was with the Steelers for a while, and then maybe a couple teams after that, kind of practice squad, training camp deal. Again, a lot of these guys fall into that category. But yeah, that was my number 9, Jalen Samuels with the San Antonio Brahmas.
I'm going to my number 8. We already saw it, obviously, but it's Frankie 4 times. When I saw Ginda in 2020, I forgot that he played not only with the Guardians, but also the San Diego Fleet several years ago. Guy led the league in college and in tackles. 2017, I think he was all conference. Some outlets had him as an All-American and all that goofy stuff. Ginda, to me, in 2023, improved his athleticism to the point where I felt that he was more than a 2-down backer. And I think we saw that by the Atlanta Falcons putting trust in this man to have him not only in training camp, but also have him on the roster. I don't think anyone could doubt that Frank Ginda could make a tackle, in the B gap or A gap. I think people were more nervous about could he drop in the coverage and whatnot. I saw at times in 2022, Ginda, they really relied on Terry Myrick to be more of the coverage linebacker, when they spread it out, in my opinion, to where Ginda kind of just played in that hook the curl zone and whatnot, or was, more of that two down linebacker. He reminded me a lot of Brandon Spikes when he was with the Patriots, and maybe shades of what's his name, Gerard Mayo, who, as on a diet scale, for lack of a better term. Ginda to me has been a tackling machine. He's been a leader. He improved in his pass defense, dropping into coverage and whatnot. I think I think he is kind of teetering on being a spring guy for life. Wanted to bring up some numbers on this, by the way. In the XFL, Ginda had 23 tackles. He started 2 games. In the AAF, he had 37 in 8 games. He started 2 of them. 194 tackles in 20 games, including what's the stat? It was like 18 tackles in a game or something like that. One player of the week 4 times, defensive player of the year for the USFL. The guy has 244 career tackles as a professional football player, not including preseason, which that's where I draw the line personally as far as what I consider. And last year he had 3 interceptions. So Ginda's a guy on the up and up, in my opinion. He's like only 26, 27 years old. This could be a make or break thing for him, but in the end, I don't see how I can have a top 10 list without including Frank Ginda on it.
Yeah, my number 8 was Frank Ginda as well, fortunately, so that'll save us a bit of time. The only other point, the only other point that I'm going to bring up that you didn't mention was, so obviously, defensive player of the year with Michigan last year, signed with the Falcons afterwards. That was the first time he'd gotten an NFL opportunity in 4 years. The last time before that was with the Saints in 2019, and that was coming off his AAF season. And I think for a guy like that, a linebacker, who's still a bit young, but he's getting into that part of his career, as you pointed out, for a guy to not be in the NFL for 4 seasons and still get an opportunity after he was in, 2 different spring leagues, played 3 spring league seasons because he had 2020 with the Guardians and then 2 Panthers seasons. That's outstanding. I mean, that alone, could put him on this list. And I think that speaks a lot to, again, we always bring up this word opportunity, and I'm not going to elaborate on it too much. But like, again, that's a great example of a guy who works hard, and really earned the opportunity. He, was out of the NFL for 4 years, and it really looked like he was never going back. He was just going to become one of these guys that stayed. And, maybe now he will, right? I think, he could become one of these staples, and he probably already is. And I think at this point he's a lifer. But the fact that he had an opportunity just this past season with the Falcons speaks a lot to his dedication, and that these leagues, even if it takes some time, that they can work and that they can put guys back in the NFL. And that's something to think about with the UFL is like, maybe some of the younger guys that you're seeing now, if this league does survive, 3+ years, because that's how Ginda was, that's how long he was out of the NFL for, 4 years or whatever. Maybe that development can happen, and we'll start to see some true stories of a guy who was not in the NFL really, and then went to the UFL, had more than 1 season of just, good tape and whatever, and then gets the opportunity after years of work. And that would feel a lot more rewarding. So ultimately, that's a bit of a side thing, but shout out to Frank. Great player, no doubt.
Yeah, that's a guy I'd love to get in studio, man. Like, throw a Zinachino in and just straight up be like, dude, how did you do it?
Yeah.
Like, how did you support yourself, your family, all that stuff? And
yeah,
I mean,
it's something
awesome,
that needs to be talked about more, really. I feel like when guys talk about Frank Ginda, they focus on his tackling ability and some of his numbers that he's put up in these leagues. But being out of the NFL for 4 years and going back, whether you've been in, playing other football somewhere or not, that doesn't happen very often. So that speaks to the type of player that he is.
Yeah. Lemon cuts, we could see another Steve Young or Reggie White develop. Those guys didn't really develop. Steve Young, yes, he needed reps and whatnot, but I mean, the USFL in the 80s was strictly like a financial decision and like paying more money. Coming in at number 7, I'm throwing Sal Cannella in there. I had him as a top 5 guy last year. I have him as probably the best tight end in this league for another year. The reason why I don't have Sage Surratt on this list is because I feel that Sage's weapons, once like you saw it last year with McLeod, he burst onto the scene and then cooled down progressively. I like Canella. I think he's got Kelsey-esque moves. I like the way he finds the soft spots in the zone. Um, if I were to give an honorable mention, by the way, I would have gave it to Jay Sternberger. Pretty high on him. I'm very. I don't. Something's not adding up when he went to camp, but I think Canella, the way he came on with Perez, especially Perez, that receiving core in Arlington is not the most dynamic for me. I could see Canella putting up a 600-yard season once again.
Yeah, no, Sal Cannell is a good pick there. I considered putting him on the list. It's tough to leave him out because again, he's starting to become one of these spring league lifers that you're not going to forget about when these leagues are all said and done. My number 7 was a spot that I debated for a while, but wanted to show some love to offensive line, so I went with my boy Alex Millette with the San Antonio Brahmas. I could have picked a lot of offensive linemen. I mean, that's one of those positions in spring football that I think is difficult to capitalize on. Offensive line talent, it's few and far between to find a guy that can do specific things that you're asking for. It's a challenge, again, to find, quality offensive linemen really at any level of football. But Alex Millette, again, I'm a bit biased because I was around him a lot last year, but I feel like this guy is probably the most refined lineman in the league just in terms of, his ability. And, I'm not a big PFF guy, but his grades were through the ceiling last year, and he spent, some of the offseason with the Detroit Lions, had a stint with them. So pretty cool ability and, team to be a part of. So yeah, man, Alex Millette at 7, great guy. And I'll leave it at that for time's sake.
Yeah, I mean, Millette is a guy that I think, as I'm doing my preseason, who is the like preseason all UFL team. It's really honestly coming down between him and Mike Panasic. And the reason why Mike got the honor last year, in my opinion, you have a guy who's new to the center position and is only going to keep getting better and whatnot. So that's where I lay with like Mike Panasic. I'm probably just going to flip a coin and pick it. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate the offensive lineman love. Love Sal Cannella, Auburn guy. Fun fact about him, by the way, he is at like 900 career receiving yards. So he'll be one of those guys that are accumulating stats that shows the success of these leagues. So very pumped about Cannella and moving forward and whatnot. Going to number 6, I got Case Cookus. Now, I'm going to throw some curveballs in here. People are going to be like, but Pat, you had Jordan Te'amu after Case Cookus. Yes, I did. But the thing is that sometimes we talk about who is the best player in the league, and that factors in so many different dynamics, in my opinion, that while I love Cookus, I think Te'amu is a better player than him, but I think Cookus will have better stats than him. Does that make sense to the 166 people watching this? So I don't, because I feel like I've said some intelligent stuff on the stream, and then I throw something like that, I think people are going to get all edgy.
I mean, I think it makes sense. He wasn't on my list, but I feel like no, it's valid. Case Cookus is a guy. He's had some NFL opportunities in between his time in the spring leagues, and yeah, I mean, I definitely see what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, Cookus coming up on 4,000 yards, coming up on 30 touchdowns in the regular season. The man is tough, and he got his butt beat last year. He's way more athletic than people give him credit for. But I definitely see another, pretty solid season. I think that Arlington team or that Memphis team is loaded, and we talked about this with DC a little bit when Sage Surratt, comes down to your third or fourth option, you're in a pretty good place. And then not talking about Darius Victor in the backfield and Trey Williams and a couple of these other guys there. I mean, I'm excited to see what's going on as far as how they push forward with that. Who is your number 6, Evan?
Yeah, my number 6 was Trent Harris, and again, another guy I was around last year when I was doing stuff with the Roughnecks. I saw how dominant he was from early on. I remember him and Tim Ward in Week 1 against the Guardians. It was just like sack after sack after sack, and all that pressure. And that game I think was divided between Paxton Lynch and Quentin Dormady, but it didn't really change the outcome because those guys were, they were rushing all night. They were bringing the pressure. So yeah, Trent is interesting. I could have put him higher maybe, but he didn't. I was really expecting him to sign with an NFL team, and I know it's not all about going to the NFL. I understand that, but I think he was invited to like Broncos mini camp and then didn't do anything from there. But I've seen how much of a force that guy is, and he's 28 now, so he's getting a bit older. Still, I mean, he's still in his 20s. It's athlete numbers, but yeah, I just with him too, it's also fit, right? I think him being with the defenders and the coaches there, and he's back with Tim Ward, all that together is why I have Trent Harris where I do on this list. And again, I'm a bit biased because I saw him more last year than some of these other players, but the work spoke for itself. I think he was the best defensive player probably in the XFL last year.
Yeah, and Trent's got a lot of experience in the NFL. I know he's had, I looked it up. I know he came from the U, was actually a reserve offensive lineman at the U, and then played about 20 games in the NFL. I literally have two computers in front of me. I could look it up, but I mean, I'm just going off memory. But I mean, let's see what happens. I am hesitant on Trent because I'm curious to see what the other pieces around. I know you got Tim Ward there and whatnot, but sometimes do they cannibalize each other? Does he get the double blocks? I don't know how athletic I think he is, and that's kind of something we're going to see coming up in one of my other picks, which I think is at number 5 when we talk about some defensive lineman skill sets and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about Trent. It'll be interesting to see how he's utilized in particular. I think one of the biggest things, why he succeeded so well with the Roughnecks last year was because he was used at the right spot. He's one of those guys where he could be, like a traditional edge. He could be a linebacker. He's a couple different things, but they used him correctly in the XFL. And I'm not sure. I haven't watched a ton of his NFL stuff, but I don't think they were doing that in the NFL, or else he probably would have been more effective.
Yeah. Well, speaking of keeping it with pass rushers, and credit to Coach Beck for the edit right there, I'm going Peter Talmopeno, man. This guy has the length I love from a defensive end. He has one of the best long arms I have seen, and I'm glad that last year the XFL really showcased his long arm. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, long arm is when they pretty much extend the body, and then from there they're able to rip through the offensive lineman, really get the offensive lineman to kind of open the bar stool essentially, or open his hips to where he's able to get skinny and rush the quarterback. And not only that, he's so strong. You saw him at some point pushing this guy. Now, I think last year the Battlehawks did not have that guy on the defensive side of the ball. I think they had a bunch of good players who came together and put up a pretty good defense. Obviously, they went 7-3. They couldn't keep up against San Antonio, against Seattle. But you add him, you add a couple other pieces, and then you kind of factor in the guys returning, like Carson Wells, one of the most underrated linebackers in this league. Mike Rose manning the middle. Defensive line is still pretty thick in there. You got Austin Faeu in there as well. I think this could really allow Pita to get on the one-on-ones, and maybe if you throw some stunts in there with Austin running the 3 technique and Pita coming from the edge. And mind you, this guy is a versatile linebacker. From there, we're going to be able to see a more inflated stat line that is going to be sexy to people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man. No, I had Pita at 4, so I'll talk about him later when we get to 4, which is the next one. You brought up a lot of good points, though, a lot of things that I can agree with. My number 5 was another kind of standout defensive guy who's returning to it's UFL now. He was in the USFL, had a couple years off, and that's DeMarcus Gates. And when I say a couple years off, I don't mean a couple years off from football. I meant that he was with the Chicago Bears, doing stuff, bouncing between practice squad, and I think he saw some action on special teams. His name was brought up, a decent amount. I'm on Twitter a lot, right? And I'm looking, some of the Bears people that I follow, they were mentioning his name, and he was there for 2 seasons. And the last time he was in the USFL, he was with the Birmingham Stallions. That's the team he's returning to. I would say this guy's a spring league staple at this point as well. I became familiar with DeMarcus 2020. He was with the Roughnecks, and I could tell immediately that was one of those guys you're like, there's a couple guys where you watch him in this league and you literally kind of say the term or the phrase, why is he not in the NFL? And I saw that with DeMarcus Gates, and he went on and he's had a couple stops in the NFL now, most recently with the Bears, where he was with them for 2 seasons. He latched on there, kind of found a home, saw some playing time. He's also been in the CFL. So this guy's been around, and I have him, pretty high. He just re-signed very recently. It was kind of a late thing. He's coming off a season with the Bears, didn't really know his status, but he's chosen to return to the UFL. And I have him really high, particularly because he's coming off that fresh NFL experience. And again, that's kind of a vague thing. People say, well, Evan, there's a lot of guys that these UFL, GMs are bringing in that were, on practice squads in 2023. You're seeing more of that fresh talent. But again, you're combining that with the stuff that he's already done in these spring leagues in the past. The wealth of knowledge that DeMarcus has acquired, I believe, is going to, pay dividends for the Stallions this year. And as if their team isn't stacked enough already, if my boy Zach Potter over there hasn't been doing enough work, I mean, this is just like cherry on top. So I've got him at 5. Again, might seem a bit rich, for a linebacker, but I like him a lot. Again, one of these guys that I feel like, when these leagues, whenever they go away, if they do go away, I hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, that's one of those guys you're going to remember for a long time.
And Gates is another guy who kind of meandered around the NFL for so long.
Definition of fringe player.
Definition of fringe player. Memphis Showboats, Houston Roughnecks, Birmingham Stallions, has 179 total tackles. That I didn't remember. That I had in my notes. So he's coming up on the longevity of 200 career tackles as a pro, was able to pop his cherry in the NFL, appeared in a couple games over the last 2 years, registered stats, not just paychecks, but stats. So there's a lot of validation there, in my opinion. Birmingham, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, once again, I think they got some good defensive linemen. No one great, but if you got some clogs in there, that's going to open up those rushing lanes, which is going to allow these linebackers to make plays. And you got, if they can't peel off on the double team, then you're going to have a lot of one-on-one stuff. And I mean, Birmingham and Houston are really the only teams using a traditional fullback, so it's going to be a lot of ISO. Make a play there, killer. So pushing on to number 4 right there. I have a Birmingham Stallion, Kavana Tizino, who many people thought should have been the Defensive Player of the Year. Flip a coin. I know he had a couple. What's the word I'm looking for? Player of the Week, All USFL guy. Finally got his shot. I believe with the was it the Niners?
Yeah.
Yeah, he got his shot with the Niners. Didn't work out. Unfortunately, things happen. I was not in camp, so I don't, I won't speak on that. But this is a guy who's been a consistent figure over the last couple of years, and now you kind of put him in John Chavis's defense, who's a good coach. He can build on what he had last year as well, and then Chavis has put together some linebackers, man. He's put together some good linebackers going back from LSU, Tennessee, all in the SEC. This is a guy, in my opinion, that could, really step on the throttle and possibly, explode. But that linebacker room with Chris Orr, Tizino, Scooby Wright, you're looking at him possibly being an afterthought. Elijah Sullivan, Traven Howard, and DeMarcus Gates. pick your poison as who's going to be the leader of that team. And that might honestly be a storyline you want to watch as far as like, is it, you got so many alpha males in there. Who's going to be the guy? Is it Scooby's room? Is it Tizino's room? Is it Gates's room? I don't know.
Yeah, Chiava Tizino for me was a really difficult guy to leave off this list. And I mean, I'm glad you put him on here and you were able to elaborate about him because even though I didn't watch the USFL as much, I was more focused on XFL stuff and then, never really picked up on the USFL too much, I admit, last season. Chiava Tizino was always a guy I was hearing about. It's like, well, check this out, and the Maulers, they went to the championship game and they played the Stallions, and now Chiava gets to be a part of that. Again, just stacked team. The team that I think, really has a chance to three-peat, just given the talent is, I mean, it's incredible. I'm not going to sit here and go on about that forever. But, yeah, I mean, he's a great player. And, again, like, we're talking about we just went back-to-back with linebackers on the same team, and that seems, again, like, pretty you're probably sitting there thinking, well, like that's pretty rich, for linebackers, especially when they're on the same team. But it's like that's just how good the Stallions have become, and the way that they've assembled their roster. And I think you said it perfectly, the pick your poison type of thing. Like Traven Howard is another guy who I watched with the Rams, a ton. And it's like they could just have, I mean, the best, kind of defensive middle there that we've seen in spring football. I think it's, easy to say that.
Yeah, I mean, nothing but respect for the team they built. But like I said, does the gluttony of riches that they have, does that negate to the individual statistics? And stats aren't everything, but stats are a lot for people who don't watch the game. And does that negate for the overarching like legitimacy of these lists and whatnot as well? So, I mean, you got Tizino, 170 plus tackles in his spring football career. Gates, another guy who's up there. Scooby Wright, I think, is around 100 career tackles between 4 seasons in his career. It just doesn't get much better.
Yeah, no, definitely. My number 4 was really quickly. I mean, Peter Tamalpeno. You already talked with him. No, you're good.
Yeah.
I mean, all I was gonna say about Peter was just like, to me, last year watching his stuff, the way I would describe his play was intimidating, and that's why I have him at number 4 as my top defensive player. Now, I had said previously, I thought Trent Harris was, the guy that was probably the best defensive player in the league last year. I'm biased, but again, watching Peter's tape, if you're going off the way that he plays, I think Pat said it perfectly. His arm length is fantastic. And to be honest, he was a guy with the Vipers, so I feel like he was kind of overlooked, and I wanted to give him his credit. And he wasn't the only dude on the Vipers who I felt like, their defense was pretty good, even for a 2-8 team. Like a lot of guys on that team that have found new homes in the UFL. Deontay Anderson, which is, I would say, is a pretty good friend now. He's with the Defenders. Shout out to him. There was a lot of guys there that were making plays, and I think Peter was obviously the best out of that group. And I forget, he was which NFL team was he with?
He was a Jets guy.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah.
So, in my opinion, I think, Coach Beck does a lot of work with the Jets. I think he might have had the inside track, in my opinion. I have no facts on that. I think that's kind of the reason why AJ didn't go to the Jets, because I think AJ would have started a bunch of games this year. And maybe Coach Beck was doing him a solid of like, hey, man, you can get paid the same amount of money to sit on that bench or get your butt beat.
No, I get it. It's like how I was flirting with that whole Matt Corral thing earlier about how like maybe PJ Walker was the one that set all this up behind the scenes and gave him something to think about. You just never know.
No, you don't, man. But I'm I definitely think the Beck connection a couple times has been pretty strong with some of the guys he's brought in. Vinny, some guys who've been in camp, some guys Iowa State. Vinny Testaverde Jr.
I will say, Beck's got, for a head coach, because he's done media and some other stuff, he has a fantastic network, and I think that's really going to help his players out moving forward. It already has, no doubt. So
Yeah. Well, that was something I asked him. I asked him last year at like one of the end press conferences. I was like, "Does your role kind of change from? Um, does your role kind of change from being a like football coach and now like kind of a recruiter in a weird way?" And that was something like he gave me a pretty good answer on. And I don't remember like all the specifics of what he said, to be honest, but you know, and I don't want to misquote, but yeah, he definitely gave some good feedback on that. Guys, we just crossed 200 people watching this. If you're watching this on Twitter, if you can go onto YouTube, drop and like and subscribe. We are on the upward to about 1K. I haven't checked the subscriber count, but I know we're pretty close to 1K. So if you guys could do that, if 10 of you could do that, you know, watch it on YouTube, that would really make my day. Analyze and educate. Extremely grateful. I know Evan is. But yeah, we're, you know, appreciate it once again. Had this man on the board for a minute. Jordan Teamu, talked about him a little bit. He's my number 3. Spring football staple, fringe NFL guy, coming up on 5,000 career passing yards. I think 33 or 34 touchdowns through the air. Add in about 900 rushing yards. So he'll be the first quarterback to break 1,000 rushing yards, most likely, God willing, and whatnot. I think his receiving core is a question, but I think just the way they have that, I mean, Abram Smith to me is the best back in the league, and I'm really looking forward to seeing him, uh, you know, go up against these loaded fronts essentially. But yeah, Jordan Teamu, it's not going to be what he does, in my opinion, through like on the stat board. It's going to be all the intangibles. It's going to be avoiding a second down sack. It's going to be throwing the ball away. It's going to be keeping his team in a position to, you know, have third and manageables where we've seen Cookus get beat up and whatnot. And that's the stuff on the stat sheet we don't talk about enough.
yeah, so full disclosure, me and Pat have the same, well, not the same top 3. We have the same guys, just in different order. So my number 3 was Abram Smith, another DC defender, who was the first overall pick in the XFL draft. I guess that was like November of 2022. Crazy to see how far we've come since then. All the
Yeah.
changes in only
Yeah.
like whatever it's been, 18 months. Yeah, Abram Smith, great story. You know, played at Baylor, spent time at linebacker. I think he was like running back first, then had a season or 2 at linebacker, and then went back to running back, kind of, you know, filled in some holes for that team, kind of, you know, did what he was needed all over the place. Came out in the 22 class, so he's still young. I think he turns 26 this year.
Yeah.
So yeah, he came out in the 22 class, undrafted, was with the Saints. You know, was their training camp preseason deal. We all know how that works. Drafted first overall by the DC Defenders, which I find funny, you know, because we've got Abram Smith here, you know, one of our top players in the league. We obviously know how good he was last year. DC also had the number 1 overall pick in the 2020 XFL draft, and they took Rashard Davis. But Rashard Davis didn't play in the XFL that year because he signed a reserve future contract with the Titans. Funny enough, Rashard is in the UFL now with the Memphis Showboats. He eventually came around and, you know, figured that would be a good route for him. So kind of funny how all that history, you know, it all ties into something. But anyways, going back to Abram Smith here, you know, played really well with DC last year. You know, had an opportunity with the Vikings, got to work with Jordan Teamu, who we've got up here on the screen. They kind of brought in the tandem. You know, was the rushing leader. I mean, it goes without saying with him. I think, you know, his trajectory just goes up. Like, he's on the same team. Everything's kind of laid out for him. You're back with your same quarterback. You know, I'll be interested to see. We talked about, you know, earlier in the show, like the defenders, how I really like their receiver room. And I feel like Teamu's going to have maybe more opportunities to throw the football. You know, not that he lacked opportunities in the past, but I just feel like he could really open it up this year. Whether or not that hinders Smith's workload, you know, we'll have to see. But either way, I mean, I think that guy, you know, he proved himself as a dynamic runner last year. So I like him.
Yeah. And, you know, like you said, full disclosure, my number 2 is Abram Smith. I love this picture of him, by the way. They were playing Vegas. It was that really, really terrible weather game that I believe made Cashman Field look subpar, um, which why couldn't they do this next year, right? I personally think the way that Fred Keiss has used both of these guys is just going to maximize the potential of what they got going on. I want to share this tweet I wrote April 25th last year, see if it pops up. If you could see it, I go, some food for thought now that the XFL season is over. Davion Smith and Abram Smith both tied Derek Clark of the Orlando Rage with 7 rushing touchdowns in a season. Abram Smith was also 10 yards short of breaking John Avery's Chicago Enforcers single season rushing record for the XFL. Um, I think he beats that, man. I think he beats that. Fred Keiss, to me, is going to put these guys in such a position to succeed. I think they go one QB system, and I think we see them grow with another year of continuity. Abram, when I did a press conference with him, talked about that a little bit, about the continuity of, it's kind of a little bit different sometimes, but in the end, they make it happen. And I'm personally like not going to be surprised to see him continue to succeed and progress in a way that we could see this be the last season of Abram Smith in the XFL. The biggest thing a lot of people always talked about was his breakaway speed and whatnot. But I mean, that to me is just unfortunate because I think this is a guy that, when especially Minnesota last year had running back issues, could have helped them out and could have continued to build on that team and whatnot. So we'll see what happens, but I don't think, when the dust settles, I think we're going to see Abram Smith, God forbid injury, as a number one running back. You know, and then we can touch on this real quick. I guess you're even Williams, but how do you feel
Common
about?
mistake. It's all
Yeah,
good. We're not going to worry about it.
yeah. How do you feel about Jalen McClendon? Do you feel he might get moved? Is he a starter with a lot of talent? I had Jalen as number 10 coming into the season. I think if uh, the league stayed separate and he was starting, statistically, he was going to put up a good year. He was going to continue to grow. Um, I like Anthony Blevins. I think they were going to adjust some things in Vegas with their with their running back and whatnot. With their offensive coordinator and everything. And I was really excited to see what Jalen can do. I think he's a starter in a 16-team league, but there's not really any quarterbacks that I'd like to see over Jalen right now, except maybe Houston if Reed Sinnett gets hurt.
Yeah, I'll say about Jalen McClendon. So I wasn't his rise last year with the Vipers, I think, was maybe the most unexpected thing of the XFL season. There's a lot of curveballs in these leagues. A lot of interesting things happen. But Jalen McClendon really came out of nowhere. And keep in mind, this was a guy, who, I think he played more. Like this was the most football he's ever played in his career. Because in college, he wasn't really doing anything. I don't know about high school, but this was his chance. This was his first time where he'd really, someone said, okay, Jalen, this is your team. Let's go out there and you're going to run the offense. I remember when he was with the LA Wildcats, way back in the day. And that was one of the first names that I remember not necessarily being familiar with in the XFL, but I was watching a game and I saw Jalen McClendon because he came in for, I think, a couple snaps. And I was this guy's interesting. I wonder what his history's like. And I was young at the time. I was just a fan, really had no proper analysis of the game, could never do, what we're doing right now, going on 2 hours of sitting here talking about a bunch of different players. But it was awesome to see Jalen get that opportunity. But ultimately, the reality is, even though he played very well, it was a small sample size, and you wonder that, I think going to DC, that's a very good position for him. I think it's going to fit his skill set. It's just, again, it was a very small sample size, and I don't there's, how do I put this the right way? I definitely agree with what you said. I think it's just like had the league stayed separate, like I think the guy would have been a starter. But I think there's still a couple things he needs to work on because in a way he is so new to the game, which doesn't seem like it because he's been around like he was in XFL 2020. But in terms of actually playing, it's all very new to him. But I feel like DC is a great place where he can refine his skills, and I would have no problem if Jordan Ta'amu gets hurt, like they can start him for the rest of the season and you feel comfortable about doing that. I think you don't, think about it twice. You don't try and bring somebody else in to, compete quickly and try and get adapted. Like I think Jalen now, like with those few games, has at least at the bare minimum proved himself to be a viable option in this league.
Yeah, I'm 100% on board with you as well. You get a guy like McClendon as your backup, you feel pretty good. Extremely disappointed that DeAndre Francois is keeping a roster spot right now. We always come back to quarterbacks, man. It's quarterbacks
That's your
forever.
specialty. I mean, you did a
That's
whole quarterback show.
yeah, among other things. But I mean, DeAndre Francois, we see the attitude he had on the field. We saw, and it's not even a rumor at this point, it's hard truth, his attitude that he jeopardized Quinn Dormandy's career by that nonsense. I know people in the Fan Control Football League weren't really that high on him as well. Kind of a, not pleasant person. And if you are going to lose your job to Ben Holmes in the spring league, then you probably need to move on with some stuff. But I mean, Jalen is a guy that I hope that they let Teamu just go for it. With the AJ stuff up in the air, I was very high on them either going back to Teamu or Brandon Silvers. To be honest with you, I think Silvers might have been a better fit in Gradkowski's scheme. But that was a guy I was kind of seeing like, hey man, let's see what's going on, with on that front. But yeah, I'm very high on this DC offense. While we don't know who the guy is at receiver, when you got Abram Smith in your backfield and Jordan Teamu, like that's a 1-2 punch. And I think Teamu was like number 5 in XFL 2020 through the 5 games in rushing yards as well. So take that information for what it's worth on that front. Number one, everyone in the chat is thinking Quentin Dormandy. What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you my number 2 before we get to number 1. We'll see if I say my number 2. Well, it kind of spoils it, but we're used to spoilers now. I said full disclosure, we got the same players. My number 2 was AJ McCarron. You had just brought up AJ briefly. I would have had him at number 1. The only thing that I feel like, with him, like he's getting a bit older, and I'm not a huge age guy. Like I know he can still play. He was, again, like, he was lights out in the league last year. And, we all know that the Battlehawks should have been in the playoffs, but that crazy math got in the way. And, hopefully they make it this year with AJ. But what's also, great about his game is like, he was in an NFL game, and I'm talking like taking NFL snaps. Two games in December, just like, a couple months ago. I mean, you want to talk about fresh, like even with his age, like this guy, and he did that with the team that he was drafted by as well. So he felt very comfortable doing it. Again, small sample size. He wasn't starting. I think he completed like 3 passes. It was just very kind of, game manager type stuff, but he was in there regardless, right? He came into a game, and that seemed like a really big deal. And again, that's going to help. That's something that Jordan Teamu, who, spoiler alert, is my number 1, did not have, but I will get into my reasons for him being number 1 later on. But yeah, I got AJ at number 2. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, no surprise here. I got AJ at number 1. The veteran presence, the reloaded receiving core. You have a guy like Ja'Cour Pearson that gets hurt, and you're kind of just like, all right, whatever. Like, it'll be fine. Because then you got Hakeem Butler, Shep, Stephen Mitchell's a guy people are sleeping on. Blake Jackson, Jerome Cap is someone that they're very high up on. Slim Shady from Hard Knocks and everything like that. But yeah, I mean, McCarron to me in 9 games, almost 2,200 yards, added 100 on the ground. 24 touchdowns, which broke Tommy Maddox's record. Technically, like I don't know how we do passing yards anymore as far as records, but he'll probably no, it'd be Cookus. I think has the most for like XFL, USFL, and whatnot. But you got Marcel Aitman there as well, which I actually it's funny. I had Marcel Aitman last year as like my number 3 player, and it's funny that he got hurt, and then Hakeem Butler literally did everything Marcel Aitman was going to do. Similar body types. Butler is a lot bigger and longer and whatnot, but I mean they're both like guys who can play on the perimeter and make plays on one. But AJ to me, the face of the franchise, go down the list, all the buzzwords. I mean, really, a guy that is good for the league. A lot of people throw shade at because they think he's like too old and whatnot. I personally don't care. Play good football, win a championship, move on with your life. I was actually against him coming to the league because I felt, and I know I've talked about this, is that there's this disgusting sense of entitlement with these players, not players, but these people who feel like AJ needs to come back. AJ doesn't have to do anything. He's going to do whatever he wants. So, in my opinion, I wanted AJ to kind of just chill because I do think he's going to go back into an NFL camp. He doesn't even have to play well. Let's be honest. Like Tim Boyle's getting contracts, Trevor Simeon's getting contracts, AJ McCarron will get a contract. Drew Plitt got a contract. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I personally feel that, from like someone who kind of cares about human beings and whatnot, when are you going to chill out? You know what I mean? Like, when are you going to go to baseball games with your kid and whatnot? And obviously he had his opinions on with Matty Fresh and everything, but yeah, I mean, I just, I'm glad he's back, from a selfish perspective, but it's a lot of reps. Mini camp starts in July. Does he want to be a late guy in the camp? I know he's got some business adventures going on and whatnot, so I know finance is probably not an issue, but at the same time, you got to chill and hang out with the family for a little bit.
Yeah, no doubt. It's an interesting point that you bring up about AJ, and I'll touch on this before I get to my number 1, which we know is Jordan Ta'amu now. But with AJ, yeah, I was one of those guys that I was honestly against him coming to the league too. I thought all the things that everybody else thought, he's too old, like the guy hasn't played enough, he's not going to be as fresh. I honestly thought he might be replaced if they named him the starter. Oh God, I'm blanking on the guy's name. Ryan Willis. I thought Ryan Willis was going to start over him. And boy, could I not have been more wrong about that. AJ, look, he's been lights out. Ryan Willis, not going to elaborate much on that. I was high on him. Quickly went away. But yeah, man, I mean, AJ, excited to see him come back for a second season. I really didn't expect that either. I mean, there's a lot of things about, his career here. Like, this is, the best football that he's played since Alabama, right? Because he just hasn't had that same kind of opportunity. And that's going back like a decade. Yeah. Well, not here. Go Tigers here. But, hey, respect. Again, I got to respect AJ for what he did with the national championships and got to learn from, one of the best in the business. And, again, he's carrying that legacy. What I really appreciate about AJ is he is the ultimate mentor for these guys that are coming in. I think he's even a mentor to probably some of the guys on that coaching staff, just because he carries so much experience. And I think, that's been really cool to see. Like, he's doing this for everybody else. He's doing it for his teammates. He's doing it for his kids. And he's, talked about that openly before. And again, just a very, down to earth type of guy. I've never interacted with him, but that's the way he presents himself. Just very open, very honest, everything you want to see from a veteran leader. With that being said, I put Jordan Ta'amu at number 1. Again, I'm still kind of, I'm a big guy with the age to a degree. I mean, that might go against what I said before, but I just feel like, Jordan Ta'amu, will have a longer career in these spring leagues, and he's already been there, for some time, and it's been up and down for him. Funny enough, Jordan Ta'amu was the OG Battle Hawk in 2020, and now we've got comparing him to AJ like it's neck and neck, which I always get a kick out of. But yeah, man, I mean, I think with Jordan, interesting, right? He came into the USFL in 22. Like, it was his return to spring football, from the Battle Hawks, which we talked about earlier. Did his, practice squad camp time in the NFL, but he was really underwhelming in the USFL that one year. Just didn't work out for him, And everybody kind of thought, well, this might be it. Like he's running out of juice, but turns out it just wasn't the right place for him because then he jumped ship to the XFL next year, lands in DC, and they just go and blow the brakes off everybody. So it's been fun to watch Jordan over the years. And again, I think we talk about just potential. Like that DC team has so much. They retained a lot of guys. They're going to keep it rolling. And I feel like Jordan Teamu is poised for a much bigger season than he had last year. And you got to keep in mind, he took the Defenders all the way to the championship game. So, I feel like there's a lot to work with there. He was also in an NFL camp with the Vikings. So he's got, some more experience under his belt. There were a lot of people that were wondering, whether or not both him and AJ, especially AJ, but Jordan too, whether or not they were going to get NFL opportunities in 2023 after their time in the XFL. And both of them did, and AJ ended up actually playing in games. So that turned out to be significant. So, yeah, even though Jordan, was only with the Vikings for a bit, didn't necessarily latch there. Again, it's another NFL camp. He was in the same room as Kirk Cousins, a guy that's an NFL veteran, has been everywhere, one of the most respected guys probably in the league now at this point in 2024. So you just keep all those things in mind and just the way he played. I love Jordan's game. And, again, I've said it so many times on the show, but, this is our last player that we're talking about here. Like, he's one of those guys you're going to remember, when this all – when we look at it in the bigger picture, it's like Jordan Teamu was one of those guys that really showed up and showed out. So shout out to him, and he's my number one on the list.
And this is kind of off topic a little bit, but I'm curious of your thoughts with ESPN behind the league and the connections, the media. If you get any of these guys like a Teamu, a Case Cookus, any quarterback, would it be advantageous or out of the realm of possibility, you think, to get them to do their own media mock-up of that? Would that be a ridiculous thing to want to see? Because to me, I think that would be amazing. Like to see that, like these guys do like for advertising and whatnot.
What do you mean by media mock-up? Just
like
curious.
Do like the cool media of spring league finally getting a chance to like actually play football.
Definitely. Yeah. No, I mean, that would be, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility at all. I mean, the reality is when these guys are finally done, and they call it a career, whenever that is, they obviously, these guys played a lot, and obviously you track the stats, who's got the most numbers and whatever. They played a lot. It was just not in the same places that everybody thinks about. And I think it would be awesome if you got like the Case Cookuses, the Jordan Thomas of the world to come together. And it's kind of like that quarterback show they're doing on Netflix where you're not necessarily, tracking their life step by step or whatever, but like, hey, like this was what life was like in all those years and all those different leagues. I mean, that would be awesome. No doubt.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be pretty amazing to see. Evan, we've been going at this probably way longer than we thought. I know we got to talk off camera a little bit too.
Yeah.
Final thoughts on this, man? Are we out of our gourd with everything as far as these rankings? I mean, overall excited for the season, obviously, but how are we feeling as far as any of the closing it up, wrapping up shop, and everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple quick honorable mentions that I'll shout out. Not going to elaborate too much because we were already going over time. But, Hakeem Butler, who you mentioned with the Battlehawks, he's a guy immediately when he was drafted, I think he was in that 22 draft. Immediately, I was like, I love that. I love that. I knew he had a future in this league, and he's proved it. Now, Marcel Aitman was injured. If that doesn't happen, does he have the same role? I don't know, but that's just how things worked out. I always thought he had so much potential as an athlete, and I'm really glad that the XFL, now UFL, has given him that opportunity. Lindsey Scott Jr. With the Renegades, who's probably going to be the backup to Luis Perez if we're, looking at projections here. Maybe Holt Nailers. I don't know. He's, that's a whole separate conversation about what he's been saying on his show and stuff. But I really like Lindsey Scott. I've talked to him before. He was drafted by the Roughnecks, eventually went to the Renegades through the dispersal stuff. Awesome guy, was one of the, my favorite college quarterbacks to watch at Incarnate Ward. Had one of the greatest seasons you'll ever see. Wasn't really projected to the NFL. He went to mini camps with the Jets and the Bucks, I think. But again, frame wise, there was a lot of things there that didn't necessarily translate. But in terms of potential, I see him as, if he gets an opportunity to start at some point, whether it's this year or next year, again, however long this thing lasts, I think he has a very bright future in this league. And I know a lot of people would probably agree. And then the last guy that I'll touch on here is Chris Odom, who is now at the Roughnecks, the Gamble Necks, whatever you want to call them, rebranded Gamblers. I hope people didn't forget his abilities. He was the 2022 USFL Defensive Player of the Year, signed with the Cleveland Browns, torn ACL right at the end of the preseason, I think, like end of August in 22. Missed that year. And then, interestingly enough, he had interest from the Guardians. Like, there was a whole thing where it was like, he was debating, do I sign with the Guardians? Do I go back to the Gamblers? And then obviously now none of that matters because it's all the same league and the Guardians don't exist. So he's with the Gamblers, back at home. I think, he's getting a bit older now, but somebody I'd watch. I feel like, people are going to be like, oh, Chris Odom, good to see him back and doing his thing. So,
yeah, I mean, a good way to end it. Big on the Chris Odom. Guys, appreciate everyone watching. We hit up to like 242 people watching at one point. If you could translate that, subscribing on YouTube really helps me out. I know a lot of people are watching on Twitter. But overall, extremely grateful to always talk ball with you, Evan. Extremely grateful to, everyone who supports me. I want to give a quick shout out to a couple people. First one is my girlfriend, Ashley, who really pushes me to do this because she knows how much I enjoy it. A lot of my buddies on my coaching staff, in addition to, my producer, Joe Trost, and Elijah, and then everyone else who always sends me a message saying, hey, good job and whatnot, and our little, clique of people that we talk with as well, who always provide, great insight, great, great content and everything like that. So I just really wanted to say thank you to all those people and let them know on the internet with this many people watching how much I appreciate and support each one of them. But guys, thank you so much. We're gonna close up shop for a little bit. I don't know when I'm gonna go back live or anything like that. Might have some interviews, while I'm traveling a little bit, not in studio, but we'll make it happen. We'll have a half decent time, and then from there, But guys, thank you so much. Enjoy your day, guys.